Have you ever reached a point where even your own breathing felt too loud, and you wondered if your tears were trying to tell you something you couldn't hear? This video is the story of how getting lost in Denmark broke me open, how silence became my teacher, how a stranger's voice pulled me back, and how every tear secretly drew a map. If you feel tired, stuck, or ready to give up, this story might be the one thing your heart has been waiting for. Arrival in the cold north. Have you ever reached a point where even your own breathing felt too loud, and you wondered if your tears were trying to tell you something you couldn't hear? This video is the story of how getting lost in Denmark broke me open, how silence became my teacher, how a stranger's voice pulled me back, and how every tear secretly drew a map. If you feel tired, stuck, or ready to give up, this story might be the one thing your heart has been waiting for. When I first stepped out of the airport in Copenhagen, the cold didn't just touch my skin, it reached straight into my bones like a quiet warning. The air felt sharp, almost metallic, and for a moment I wondered if winter here had learned how to speak before I did. Even the sky looked unfamiliar, a pale gray that seemed to whisper, "You're not home anymore." The wheels of my suitcase rattled against the cobblestones, echoing through streets that were too clean, too silent, too calm for the chaos inside me. People walked past wrapped in thick coats, their faces rosy from the cold, their voices low and soft, like they understood the rules of a world I had not been invited into yet. Every sound felt amplified. The distant ding of a bicycle bell, the hiss of a bus door closing, the slow hum of wind weaving around narrow streets. I remember trying to steady my breath, telling myself to relax, but the truth is simple. I felt small. Smaller than I had ever felt in my life. As if Denmark itself was holding up a mirror, forcing me to see the anxiety I had been avoiding for years. A part of me knew this trip was supposed to be a fresh start. But standing in that icy air, surrounded by a language I didn't understand and a silence that pressed against my chest, I felt something crack inside me, softly, quietly, like thin glass under pressure. And I hadn't even gotten lost yet. A silence that gets too loud. There is a strange kind of silence in Denmark. Not the peaceful kind you read about in travel blogs, but the kind that slowly crawls under your skin and makes you hear things you didn't know were living inside you. On my second day there, I walked through a quiet neighborhood in Frederiksberg, and the stillness felt almost artificial, like someone had pressed a giant mute button on the world. Cars moved gently, as if apologizing for existing. People spoke in soft tones that floated away before my ears could even catch them. Even the birds seemed disciplined, chirping in tidy little patterns. And there I was, walking with a heartbeat so loud it could have been a marching band. It's funny how silence exposes everything. Back home, noise had always protected me. Traffic, neighbors, the clutter of everyday life. But here the quiet peeled away that protection, layer by layer, until I could hear thoughts I had successfully ignored for years. Thoughts like, "Why are you here? What are you running from? What are you hoping to find?" At one point I sat on a bench near a frozen lake. The ice wasn't thick enough to walk on, but it was solid enough to crack in tiny, sudden snaps that echoed across the water. Each snap startled me, not because the sound was loud, but because it reminded me I was alone in a place that didn't know my name. A mother passed by with her child. They spoke Danish, a melody of rounded vowels and soft consonants. I caught only a few words, but the tone, warm, effortless, made my chest tighten. It reminded me of something I didn't want to admit. Even when you are surrounded by people, Loneliness can sit right beside you like an uninvited guest. I started to wonder if this was why some people break down in foreign countries. Not because life is worse, but because silence gives your inner world a microphone. Every insecurity becomes louder. Every fear becomes clearer. Every doubt begins to sound like truth. And in that amplified inner world, my own tears began to draw their first invisible line, the first mark on the map I didn't know I was creating. Crying on Copenhagen streets. There's a moment in every foreigner's life when the city you're in suddenly stops being charming and becomes a maze you can't escape. Mine happened on a gray afternoon in Copenhagen, the kind of afternoon where the clouds hang low, like they're eavesdropping on your thoughts. I had taken the wrong bus. Not just one stop, but completely the wrong direction, and ended up somewhere I couldn't pronounce, surrounded by buildings that all looked the same. I tried to stay calm. You can figure this out, I told myself. But the streets seemed to twist in circles, and each turn felt like a new reminder that I didn't belong here. My phone battery dropped to 3%. The wind picked up, and the cold felt personal. The funny part? No one around me seemed rushed. A cyclist passed by with a basket of groceries. An older couple walked arm in arm, smiling at something only they understood. Even the streetlights looked peaceful. Meanwhile, I could feel my throat tightening, that familiar pressure that tells you tears are coming whether you approve or not. When my phone finally died, it was like the universe pulled the last thread holding me together. I stopped on a quiet corner, between a bakery that smelled like warm cinnamon, and a row of apartments with windows glowing soft yellow. And the moment I stood still, the tears arrived. Not dramatic tears. Not cinematic tears. Just the quiet kind that slip out because your heart is tired and your body can't pretend anymore. I remember trying to hide it. I turned my face away from the street, pulled my scarf higher, wiped my cheeks with my gloves. But in Denmark, the silence is too honest. It doesn't let you hide from yourself. So the tears kept coming slow and steady, forming their own path down my face like they knew exactly where they wanted to go. A part of me felt ridiculous. Who cries because they got lost? But the deeper truth is simpler. The tears weren't about the streets. They were about every moment I had felt lost long before this trip. Copenhagen just gave the feeling a location. And standing there, cold and overwhelmed, I didn't know it yet, but those tears had just drawn the second line on the map that would eventually lead me back to myself. Why we break inside. There is a strange moment, right before someone breaks, when the body tries to negotiate with the mind. It whispers things like, "You're fine. Just breathe. Don't make a scene." But the truth is, the body usually knows long before the mind is ready to admit it. And on that cold Copenhagen afternoon, standing with tear-stained gloves and a dead phone, my body had already signed the surrender papers. What surprised me wasn't the breakdown itself. It was how quickly it arrived. One wrong bus. One unfamiliar street. One snap of cold wind. And suddenly I was unraveling. But later, when I looked back, I realized something important. Breaking doesn't happen because of what's in front of you. It happens because of everything you've been carrying. Humans are weird like that. We walk around with invisible backpacks full of old fears, old failures, old versions of ourselves that we never had the courage to throw away. And then one small thing, getting lost, a missed train, a harsh word, a quiet night, tips the whole pile over. My invisible backpack was heavy. I had been running on hope, pressure, and a quiet desperation to start fresh. Denmark wasn't supposed to break me. It was supposed to fix me. But life has this strange talent for healing us by first showing us the wounds we pretend don't exist. As I stood there in that quiet street, I could almost hear my mind arguing with my heart. You're overreacting. No, you're finally reacting. Psychologists say that unfamiliar environments amplify emotions because the brain loses its sense of predictability. Without familiar cues, the mind becomes hyper-aware of danger, of loneliness, of every possible mistake. Your nervous system basically throws a tiny internal tantrum, shouting, "This is too much." And honestly, it was too much. Not because Denmark was harsh, but because I had arrived already cracked, already exhausted, already carrying more than I knew how to hold. The tears weren't a failure. They were an answer, the only language my heart could speak at that moment. And as strange as it sounds, that quiet breakdown on a random Copenhagen corner was the first honest conversation I'd had with myself in years. It was the third line on the map. The map drawn not on paper, but with tears. Kindness in unexpected places. The thing about breaking down in public is that it makes you believe everyone is watching, but in reality, people are too busy living their own quiet battles. That's why I didn't expect anyone to stop. I didn't expect anyone to notice. I certainly didn't expect kindness. But kindness has a strange habit of appearing in places where logic says it shouldn't. I was still standing there, cheeks frozen from tears, trying to decide whether to walk left or right, when I heard footsteps slow down behind me. Not rushed, not intrusive, just gentle. Then a soft voice said, "Are you okay?" In English touched with that unmistakable Danish warmth. A calm, steady tone that felt like someone placing a hand on your shoulder without touching you. I turned around, embarrassed. It was a woman in her 30s, holding a paper bag of still warm pastries. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and her eyes had that softness people get when they've learned how to listen before they speak. "I think I'm lost," I admitted, my voice cracking in the middle like a weak branch. She didn't laugh. She didn't look annoyed. She didn't rush to correct me. Instead, she smiled. A small, understanding smile that made the tightness in my chest loosen just a little. "Everyone gets lost here in the beginning," she said. "Even Danes." She pointed toward a bus stop, not far away, and explained slowly, clearly, with a kindness that felt almost unreal. She didn't overwhelm me with details. She didn't make me feel stupid. She just guided me one small step at a time. And then she did something I'll never forget. She handed me one of the pastries from her bag. "It's warm," she said. "It helps." It did. The heat seeped into my cold fingers. The cinnamon scent wrapped around me like a quiet hug. And for the first time that day, I didn't feel like a foreigner. I just felt human. It's strange how one gentle voice can silence a storm inside you. How one stranger can make a foreign country feel slightly less foreign. How one simple act of kindness can draw a new line on the map you're unknowingly creating. A line that doesn't point to a place, but to a possibility. That day, I learned something small but life-changing. Sometimes the world answers your tears with warmth. Pieces of a broken self. There's a strange silence that follows a breakdown. Not the silence around you, but the silence inside you. It's the moment after the tears stop, when your body feels empty, like it finally released something it had been holding for years. That night in my small Danish room, I felt that silence settle over me like a heavy blanket. The radiator hummed softly in the corner. The window pane shook every time the wind pushed against it. I sat on the edge of the bed with the pastry wrapper still in my pocket, thinking about the woman who had helped me. I didn't know her name. I would probably never see her again. But her kindness had cracked open a thought I wasn't ready for. Maybe breaking isn't the end. Maybe breaking is the beginning. But when you're alone in a foreign country, beginnings feel fragile. That night, every insecurity I'd tried to outrun climbed out from the shadows. They sat around me like uninvited ghosts. Memories of things I failed at, words I'd left unsaid, versions of myself I kept trying to bury, and honestly, I didn't know what to do with all of them, so I just sat there listening to my own breathing, listening to the soft hum of Denmark at night, listening to parts of myself I had ignored for far too long. It felt like picking up shards of a broken mirror. The reflection was distorted, but it was still me. Some nights in Denmark stretched longer than they should have. Time didn't pass, it hovered. The silence became a spotlight, revealing things I didn't want to confront. The fear of failing. The fear of not being enough. The fear that maybe I had come here searching for something I couldn't name because I didn't know it existed. But here's the strange part. Once the fears showed themselves, they didn't seem as powerful as before. They became shapes I could hold, examine, question. And slowly, very slowly, I began to gather the pieces of myself. Not to glue them back the way they were, but to understand them. To see what could stay. To see what needed to be let go. That night didn't fix me. It wasn't a miracle. But it was the first time I realized something important. Sometimes you rebuild your life not with strength but with gentleness. And sometimes gentleness is enough to begin again. The map drawn with tears. By the end of that week, something strange had started to happen. I realized that every tear I had cried, every moment I had felt lost, every silence I had endured, was quietly creating something I hadn't noticed at first. A map. Not a map of streets or bus stops, but a map of where I had been inside myself, and where I might go next. I remembered walking past the little canal near Nyhavn, the colored houses reflecting in the water like a watercolor painting. I had no sense of direction at that moment, but I could feel my steps lining up along an invisible path. Each step was marked by a memory. A tear on a cobblestone, a shiver in the cold, a heartbeat racing when I realized I didn't know how to ask for help. And somehow these invisible lines connected, forming a quiet guide that only I could read. Tears had a strange logic. They weren't random. They highlighted pain, yes, but also the edges of resilience. The spots where I had chosen to stand, even when fear whispered to run. The places where a stranger's voice had reached me when I thought I was unreachable. Even the tiny victories, finding my way, understanding a Danish word, laughing at my own mistakes, became landmarks on this map. I began to understand something important. The map wasn't showing me how to avoid tears, or how to escape the hard moments. It was showing me how to follow them, to see where they led. Each tear was a line drawn not in shame, but in honesty. And honesty, I realized, was more powerful than any shortcut or plan I could ever make. Standing on the bridge that evening, listening to the soft ripple of the water, I felt a quiet pride. I had been scared. I had been lost. I had cried on streets I would never forget. And yet, here I was, following a map that only made sense because of the tears themselves. It was messy, imperfect, deeply human, and it was mine. The city no longer felt cold or alien. Even the silence didn't feel threatening anymore. I could hear it differently now, like a teacher guiding me through the invisible paths of my own heart. And slowly I realized the truth. The map drawn with tears doesn't just show you where you've been. It shows you where you are capable of going. Where your tears lead you. Looking back now, I can trace every step, every misstep, and every tear on that invisible map. It led me through streets I couldn't pronounce, past strangers whose kindness I didn't expect, and into nights where silence became louder than any fear. And yet, it also led me to a place I had almost forgotten existed. Myself. There's a strange power in tears. Not the kind that makes you weak, but the kind that shows you the edges of your courage. Every time I cried on a Copenhagen street, every time my chest ached from loneliness, it wasn't just sorrow. It was a signal, a quiet compass pointing me toward understanding, toward acceptance, toward growth. My tears were not a sign of defeat. They were a blueprint. By the end of my time in Denmark, I realized that these invisible lines, drawn with moments of vulnerability, with quiet desperation, and with fragile hope, had built something far more valuable than I could have imagined. They had built resilience. They had built empathy. They had built the ability to see that even when everything feels foreign and overwhelming, you can navigate the world and yourself if you are willing to follow the signals of your heart. The city that once felt cold and unwelcoming now felt alive with stories, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be understood. I could hear the rhythm of life in the footsteps of people walking past, the rustle of winter coats brushing against each other, the distant laughter of children. The sounds were no longer overwhelming. They were a language I was learning to understand, slowly but surely. And in that way, even my tears had trained me. They had trained my ears, my heart, and my mind to listen more closely to the world and to myself. If you are feeling lost, tired, or ready to give up, remember this. The map drawn with your tears is not a record of weakness. It is a record of bravery. Every drop leads you somewhere, even if you cannot see the path yet. Your tears have a destination, one that will always guide you toward who you are meant to become.